Good morning from Ireland. This is Francis from McCaffrey's Crafts, and today I thought we'd continue on our series Blackthorn and Irish Stick Fighting. And today I wanted to talk about record keeping, in that there was only a certain point in which records were actually taken, and I just want to kind of highlight how that was done, when it was done, and bring up a few opinions I have on it as well. Like, it was the most violent fights were always kind of recorded between 1824 and 1836. That was kind of seen as the peak of faction fighting, but that is only from what was when records were being taken. It's like it's kind of important to note that there was no system for regular reporting to Dublin of faction fights prior to the 1800s, because the union wasn't set up then, which was called like the union, and they had like a reporting structure set up. And it was not even until the 1830s to every faction fight was reported in detail. And again, that's kind of an important point to notice. Actually, in fact, the very first official faction fight, as called the faction fight, wasn't officially listed until 1837. And that year there were 18 faction fights, but also 157 riots. Now, here's a very important thing to notice: the difference between a riot and a faction fight. To someone reporting it, they were reporting faction fights as riots, because they're just looking at two groups attacking each other with weapons, with sticks, with stones, with everything. They didn't know what they were watching. They just were, English people there, and they were just, from the police side of things, and they were, oh my God, what's going on here? Big faction fight. They didn't know it was a faction fight. They just thought it was a big riot. So first point is important to know is that many of these fights were recorded in details as riots as opposed to faction fights. And again, the very first official faction fight wasn't recorded until 1837. And then just kind of looking back in that, say for example, I have a few figures written down here. So even right up until like 1833, most faction fights were still being reported as riots. And in 1833, for example, the number of riots given was 539. In 1827, there were 1,001 riots recorded. That was the high point, and the low point was in 1822, where 253 riots were recorded. So the recording started just in the 1800s, and initially they were recorded as riots, and again, it was right for a number of years before they were actually recorded in great detail. And then this kind of tapers off as you kind of go in. Like, say for example, all the way up until the famine started in 1847, there was just one official faction fight recorded by the police there. But there were also that year 137 riots were recorded. Now, I think at this point some of the riots might have been done to what was called famine riots, which were happening at the time, where of course people were quite hungry and starving to death, and again a number of riots would call. So it's kind of, at that point, it's hard to say if a riot was a faction fight or a famine fight. But right up until then, I think it's safe to assume that a number of recorded riots, and given the details that were in the riots that were recorded, they specifically refer to faction fights. It's just they didn't have the official name of that. Now, again, even prior to 1837, like there's instances of faction fights reported by, not just reported straight to Dublin Castle, which would be in like official reports, but police stations and magistrates would record some of these fights as well, but they wouldn't, be all the way up to the official records in Dublin Castle. Like, say for example, nine of these fights were recorded in Tipperary in 1808, 12 in 1810, 102 of these fights in 1836 in Limerick. Say in Tipperary, I mean. And then in Limerick, 14 were reported in 1808, and 75 of these type of big mass fights were described in 1812. So again, A lot of these records, and the point of this video is that from the 1800s onwards, there were records of these faction fights, but the faction fights were in full swing in the 1800s. Now, that does not mean that the faction fights were not happening in the 1700s and the 1600s. The only problem, and it's like anyone who researches even genealogy and their family history in Ireland, records don't go back that far. There's not a lot of documentation out there. And again, it's very hard. Like, there's only a very few sources as you go further back in Ireland. So again, a lot of the faction fights, you might get the impression, started in 1805 in Tipperary. That's because there was a huge riot, and the details of that came out. But the spark of the faction fighting was, in my opinion, and I think the documents kind of can support this as well, that it was going on well before the 1800s. That's just when records started being recording, and it's kind of naive to think that that's when it began, given that it's only just then is right, the records are starting, these fights are going on. And maybe in the next video I'm going to look to see if we can find any evidence before the 1800s of when the faction fights were going on. And usually these are through songs and something by poets and writings and different things like that. That would be the kind of only, because usually poets and songwriters would be writing about the times of what was going on, and they would be writing on current events that they would see. So I do think they are pretty good sources when you're looking historically at things in Ireland. Of course, they're going to make things sound a bit more exciting, being a poet or being a writer or being a bit more flamboyant, but essentially the core of what they were saying, if they saw a faction fight and they, this guy took off these heads and he ripped off this, obviously they're going to be using a lot of creative language to describe this battle, but it could be just a bit of a riot that was going on between two factions as well. So I just wanted to highlight again, records only just began 1800s, and let's we'll keep this under the microscope for another video as well, when we try to look back before the 1800s. And thank you for watching today. Okay, goodbye.